Okay, so good afternoon to everyone joining us from across the Mediterranean, the Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. Welcome to the fourth session of the Red Sea Dialogues, a high-level webinar series jointly hosted by the Mediterranean Platform and the Pan-African Agenda Institute. I'm Dr. Dalia Ghanem. I am a senior visiting fellow at the GMF, German Marshall Fund, and I am delighted to serve as your chair and moderator today. We are launching today conversation on the heels of a massive milestone. I am incredibly proud to present once again our newly released volume, The Red Sea Divided by Water, United by Opportunities, Pathways from Competition to Cooperation. I had the privilege of co-editing this volume alongside Dr. Meharita Dalimaru, Luigi Narboni, and Carlo Paleggi. For too long, policy analysts have looked at this vital corridor through a fractured, one-sided lens. This volume shatters those analytical silos. We have brought perspective from the MENA region, the Gulf, into direct conversation with those from the Horn of Africa to examine how maritime security, state survival, and regional statecraft collide across both shores. If you want to understand how the old rules of global waterways are being rewritten by regional middle powers, this book is your essential roadmap. I highly encourage all of our participants to download the open access publication via the Mediterranean Platform website today. So today's session hits directly at one of the book's most volatile case studies, Turkey's rapidly expanding footprint. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz no longer stay localized. They spill right into the Bab el-Mandeb, turning the Red Sea into a landscape of intense proxy competition, state vulnerability, and remilitarization. Smack in the middle of this storm sits Ankara, pulling off a high-stakes strategic hedging act, balancing Middle East turmoil against aggressive economic and security expansion into Africa. To unpack this balancing act, we have a stellar panel of experts with us today. Dr. Kan Devigiulu, coordinator of North and East Africa Studies at Oxfam. Jawhara Telkmal Kanu, political economy analyst and development practitioner. Ozgi Genç, visiting fellow at the Middle East Council. And Dr. Abdullahi Ali, public policy expert and veteran East African organizational leader. So let's skip the long lectures and dive straight into the friction point. Kan, let's start with you. In our book, we argue that maritime security always begins on land. From Ankara perspective, how does Turkey view its military and commercial assets in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb in light of the current Middle East escalations?
Okay. Thank you very much for your inviting, and, dear Dalia. That's a really interesting question. I think it also reflects a debate that we often see when people discuss Turkey's role in the Red Sea. Usually, the discussion is framed in two ways. Either Turkey is reacting defensively to regional instability, or it's trying to use the current turmoil to expand its influence. Personally, I think reality is somewhere in between, or perhaps even outside these two options. The way I see it, Turkey is less interested in competing for influence than in building what I call an intercoastal strategic architecture across the Red Sea. Let me explain what I mean. One of the key arguments in our book is actually very simple. Maritime security begins on land. Sometimes we focus too much on ships, naval bases, or maritime choke points. But if the coastal states themselves are unstable, you simply cannot have lasting maritime security. For Ankara, Bab el-Mandeb is not only a strategic waterway, it's a a region where security at sea depends directly on stability on land. And that's why Turkish engagement has never relied on only one instrument. Yes, there is military cooperation, but there is also mediation, humanitarian assistance, infrastructure, education, energy cooperation, institutional building. There are not separate policies. They are all part of same strategy. If I had to summarize that strategy in one sentence, I will simply say, if Somalia collapse, maritime security collapse. And I think this explains why Somalia has become so central to Turkey's Red Sea policy. Sometimes people reduce Turkish engagement to the Turksom military base. Honestly, I think that's too narrow. If Turkey's objective was simply military projection, it wouldn't spend 15 years investing in hospitals, scholarships, public institutions, ports, and humanitarian assistance. In my opinion, Turksom is not where the story begins. It's where the story arrives after years of state building efforts. That's an important distinction. Now, regarding the second part of your question, is Turkey taking advantage of instability? Well, every country adapts to changing geopolitical realities. It's a natural process. But adaptation doesn't necessarily mean opportunism. Take the Ethiopia-Somalia crisis as an example. If Turkey's priority had been geopolitical expansion, it could have increased its military footprint. Instead, Ankara invested something much more difficult to build political trust. If it hosted several rounds of negotiations and helped facilitate what eventually became the Ankara Declaration. To me, that tells us something important. When diplomacy is still possible, Ankara seems to prefer diplomacy over military escalation. Another point I would make is that Turkey's approach is quite different from many other external actors operating in the region. It's not trying to dominate only the African coast, nor is it focusing exclusively on the Arabian side. Instead, it's trying to remain engaged with both, with Somalia, Djibouti, Sudan, and Ethiopia on one side, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Yemen on the other. That's why I use the term intercoastal strategic balancer. Not because Turkey is neutral. No country is completely neutral. But because it tries to build relationships across both shores instead of choosing only one geopolitical camp. And I think that's an important difference. So if I had to answer your questions in one sentence, I would probably say Turkey is neither simply reacting to instability nor exploiting it. It's trying to convert its growing security presence into long-term diplomatic influence. Whether that strategy succeeds will depend less on military capabilities and much more on whether Ankara can preserve political trust across both sides of the Red Sea. And in my opinion, that's going to be the real test over the next few years, I think.
Thank you, Kaan, for this. I love the concept of intercoastal strategic balance. Clearly, you showed that Turkey is playing the long-term diplomacy, and Ozgi will talk about it later. But let's move before that to Jawhara. Clearly, Ankara's strategy isn't just about hard military power. It relies heavily on economics as a statecraft. So, Jawhara, I want to bring you in here to tackle this point. When Turkey signs these sweeping maritime and investment deals, how does that reality translate for local communities on the ground?
Thank you. Thank you, Dalia, for the question. Can you confirm if you can hear me well?
We can.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think to answer your point about how these deals that have been signed, whether economic and other have other effects on local communities, I think it's important to look at the case of Sudan as a clear demonstration of, from my point of view, of how the Turkey model of involvement in the Horn and even in Africa, if I may say. For the case of Sudan, of course, there are different historical nuances to it. There is a historical relationship between Sudan and Turkey that dates many decades ago. Over the past years or the past few decades, there have been always some ideological, if I may say, linkages between the regime in Sudan and Turkey, and this has paved the way for entrance of many investments and service related kind of interventions in Sudan. Of course, nowadays people look at different things. They look at the military side of things, about the Turkish supplies of military equipment to the government, specifically Sudanese armed forces. There were also recently reports about Turkish equipment being used by the RSF, different explanations of how they were obtained. And there were also some other points about the political involvement of Turkey in the Sudan war. The economic side has always been there in different shapes and forms. Over the years, Turkey has been involved in different sectors in Sudan, mainly in agriculture, electricity, as a service delivery, even in the banking sector. More recently, there were deals signed about for maritime development in the eastern part of Sudan, and this has been ongoing, as I said, in different areas of Sudan. What is striking is that because of the soft diplomacy or the soft relationship that Turkey has had with Sudan, this has always been perceived as a less kind of conditional kind of support from outside. If you compare it to other investments from other countries that come with conditionality, that come with institutional intervention, again, if I may say, the Turkish investments have always been perceived, I would say, by the Sudanese side as a more softer way of investing in infrastructure, services, and so on. One clear example that I've been following, and I don't know if it's much studied, is example of the Turkish investments in the electricity sector in Sudan. For years, Turkey have been investing in different forms, namely two main ones. One is through a company that has been supplying power to the national grid of Sudan out of a floating ship in the Red Sea. And this is claimed to provide at some point 10% of the electricity in the country. Another form of investment has been through isolated plants that are in Darfur specifically, mainly in Niala and Al-Fashir, the two biggest capitals in the region of Darfur. And of course, Sudan has been having an ongoing energy crisis where there isn't enough energy being produced to cover the whole grid or even to cover the local demand. Hence, this investment is a good thing for the government to have, and also for the local communities to be having this electricity supply. But when we look at the dynamics of it, it's a bit more complicated. For example, the power plants that have been ongoing in Darfur, of course, this has stopped with the war, just for your reference here. But the power plants that have been running in the capitals of Darfur, the model of working was that the citizens or the community would pay the money of the electricity to the government, and the government is supposed to pay the Turkish companies. But this was not always the case. In fact, there've always been reports that there is a huge indebtedness from the government to these companies, and hence the companies, what they would do is that they would shut off the electricity from the local community. So it seems like the community is somewhat trapped between the government and the companies. And this has been ongoing, and it has completely stopped with the war because, of course, for businesses, they wouldn't necessarily take the risk of continuing to invest here. So this is one example of how the service delivery can actually be not necessarily matching the community needs at a particular time, specifically when it doesn't come with institutional guarantees or enough institutional guarantees from the state. Another example, as I said, is the other power plant that is being powered out of Port Sudan. This one is still functioning and has been working and has continued, and at least the service has been restored. When I look at the example of Turkish investments in power in Sudan, the main outcomes for me would be indeed the service is being delivered, and indeed in not just in Sudan but in many communities, the Turkish investment would be the first to enter a conflict zone or a post-conflict zone, but not necessarily the community is well centered in decision making and also taken into account in stages after investment. And this actually, I think, leads us to the conversations that are happening today about Turkish re-involvement in Sudan. For example, the government of Sudan has had a joint trade mission with Turkey in May this year, which is very recent, and they've been talking about free trade agreement between the two countries, whereby imports and exports are exchanged between the two countries at different rates. But it also poses the question of the legitimacy of these agreements that are crafted in a time of war, where citizens don't have oversight over these agreements and don't have the means to verify and monitor the outcomes of these agreements. From Turkey's point of view, I think being one of the first returnees in terms of investment to a country, of course, gives you an advantage in the future. And we've seen this example in other countries in the Horn. So by positioning these agreements at the moment, I think this only paves the way for more kind of work in the future, but work that doesn't necessarily center citizens, as I said, doesn't necessarily center communities, and they don't necessarily have the means or the information to verify the outcomes. Yeah, so to sum it up, they're indeed good, but it's not necessarily centered in communities. And in the bigger picture, the way I look at it, I don't look just at the investment that Turkey is doing. I also look at the package as a whole, the military, political, and economic interventions. And from the way I look at it, I don't think the economic investments cancel out the damage that is being caused by military equipment and others. And this is my take on it.
Thank you, Jawhara, for this. I think we have a small technical issue because you can't see me, but you can hear me, though. But I will still move on with the next question, and I will follow up with you, Jawhara. Speaking about these, deals, are these partnerships? Again, I insist on this, but are these partnerships building real economic resilience? Or are they feeding into existing local vulnerabilities? Because you talked a bit about the perception of these deals. Can you tell us more?
I would say they are indeed contributing to local vulnerability because if it doesn't take into account the community needs, for example, at a time of war, of course, the community would want to have the power, and it's not there. For 3 years and entering the 4th year now, the Darfur region has completely been off power because the Turkish companies that sign deals are no longer there. I understand that the situation of war is not ideal for companies to remain, and there are safety issues. But even for these power plants to be reinstituted or relaunched, it wouldn't be possible because the technical staff are not there, and the expertise is not there, and the companies are demanding the money that has been invested, that has been they've been indebted for. So this is the first element. The second element, I think there is also the element of the state responsibility, because at the end of the day, the state doesn't sign deals that make the companies liable for these kind of situations. and they don't put in place measures that mitigate these situations. Because even before the war, whenever the government doesn't pay, the companies will just shut off the power, and that was not ideal, and it doesn't contribute to community development. Rather, again, capitalizes on existing vulnerability.
Thank you, Jawhara. That economic dimension, I guess, lead us directly to regional governance. And I'm going to turn to Abdullahi here. You have spent 25 years navigating public policy and community development frameworks in East Africa. From where you stand, how are sovereign states in the Horn of Africa navigating Turkey's strategic hedging?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I'm going to try to share an overview of the Turkish influence in the Horn of Africa and how the states are responding to that. I would also like to start with the case of Somalia and how that shaped the Somali-Turkish relationship in the past 15 years or so. And I want to start with the historical relationship between the Turks and the Somalia and Turkey, being among the oldest partnership between the Horn of Africa and external powers, dating back to the 16th century through commercial, religious, and cultural exchanges. As many of you might remember, the modern relations between Somalia and Turkey revitalized in 2011 when Turkey became one of the first countries to establish a diplomatic presence in Somalia after decades of state collapse in Somalia. And a very vivid, memorable moment within the Somali context is the 2011 when President Erdogan visited Somalia during famine and the height of insecurity and stability in Mogadishu, distinguishing Turkey from many traditional partners that engaged Somalia remotely at the time. Then, there is also that question of, in this context, and I will, expand on this later, but why specifically is Somalia important for Turkey, but also for many other powers. One reason is because of its location along the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb, and the access to the Indian Ocean, emerging offshore oil and gas potential, and its central role to the Red Sea and Indo-Pacific maritime security. Now, as I mentioned, Turkey's engagement in Somalia has evolved in several phases. And as I mentioned earlier, the first phase, again, we are talking about this modern relationship between the two. 2011 to 2000, Turkish government, private or public humanitarian organizations have provided emergency humanitarian assistance during the famine, reconstructions of hospitals. I can mention the rehabilitation of the what used to be a famous hospital in Mogadishu, Dikfer, that was built by the Italians during the colonial era. that was renamed after Erdogan. Schools, public infrastructure, some sort of diplomatic normalization and reopening of the Turkish embassy in Mogadishu. And then there's also the period of 2014 to 2016, where that relationship kind of moved more into development partnership, expansion into infrastructure, aviation, education, commercial investment, and so on. And then during that period, there was also increased Turkish private sector involvement in Mogadishu. And then to some extent in other parts of Somalia. But I also want to mention, as this was happening, there were also engagements and involvements of Turkish humanitarian organization, development, and private sector in other parts of the region as well, including Kenya, Ethiopia, which currently Turkish is the second largest investor in Ethiopia. And then there was 2017 onward, where this is when the former president Farmajo was in power. That is when the defense and security cooperation have strengthened. You had Turkish government now picking up training, providing military trainings, institutional capacity building, maritime cooperation, discussion on energy, oil, gas, and offshore exploration. That is when all these conversations kind of now started. Back then. And I also want to mention in the opposition, he was a staunch critic of the Turkish relationship with the government of the day back then. Now, the question is why Turkey became a trusted partner in Somalia. And I will say one of the I talked about the perception of the Somalis and that historical relationship, but in this new relationship, the long-term engagement the Turkish have shown rather than short-term crisis response in Somalia is key to that trust that developed. And then there's also that integration of humanitarian assistance with development, diplomacy, and security. Because for Somalia, security, development, and diplomacy is not a matter of choice. It's a country that is coming out of crisis, instability, has been a failed state for a long time. So not that many partners were able to not take a risk. To trust and take a risk. So it's to many, to the Somalis, it feels like the Turkish filled that gap. And then this strong support for Somalia's internationally recognized government. When you have semi-autonomous federal member states who have external relationships with either other Gulf, some Gulf countries, other Horn of African states in the region, and now raising that question of are the federal member states becoming more powerful, than the federal government. The fact that many are strengthening their partnership with us federal member states and not with the federal government and Turkish now government stepped in to empower the federal government. That is also what creates that trust. And then the relatively limited historical package the Turkish is coming in with compared to the colonial powers is also another reason why Turkish kind of became a trusted partner. And then I think it's also outside safer to say that Turkey enjoys broad acceptance across much of the Somali society, making opposition to bilateral relations.
Abdullahi, how would you explain this? Because you said it's not a former colonial power, but it also have this perception that it is much more accepted. Why? Do you have an idea?
In this region, I mean, compared to the European colonial powers, the historical relationship that I have explained, and also the fact that the Turkish came in at a very critical time to provide not only humanitarian assistance but development, security support. That I think is why the Turkish are seen differently in this case. And but despite this strong relations, there is also criticism. Very early stage of this relationship that started in 2011. There were strong criticism from various political groups in Somalia, academics, people who have followed the security, politics, and economical development in the region. But many Somalis that Turkey was exploiting Somalia's fragility for strategic and commercial gains. So that has been, a criticism, and still you have the Somali opposition that believe the Turkish government is empowering the current government in the expense of the other political groups. And then there's also concern over elite culture, if you will, where you have very powerful ministers, members of the government that are connected to the Turkish establishment in one way or the other, that are seen as dominating the political spaces in the country. And many of this is because of the political influence through economic investment. And then there's also the question of access to natural resources. Is that competitive? Why Turkey? And are there deals made behind the scene that is not, in the case of the agreement that was signed back in 2024, that was not publicized until that was tabled at the Turkish parliament. So many Somali politics institutions were not even didn't even know the details of that agreement. And then the Turkish, sorry, go ahead. And probably I'm taking longer, but I'm happy to summarize.
That. But I guess there is clearly here, a shift, because Turkey was seen more of at the beginning as a neutral alternative to traditional powers and European ones, especially. But today there is clearly a growing worry about the country becoming, more into, this larger proxy game. And this brings us, I guess, very nicely to the core paradox of Turkish foreign policy. And I'll move here to Ozge. Ozge, your work maps regional stability and mediation framework very closely. Ozge and Ozge is the author of a book on mediation by middle power we are doing with Dalia Dasakai from UCLA, and she wrote the chapter on Turkey as being a middle power and engaged in mediation. But clearly, Turkey explicitly positioned itself as a diplomatic mediator, and you showed that beautifully in your chapter. Yet, at the same time, it is a massive exporter of drones and hard defense tech across the African continent. So, Ozge, can you tell us more about how does Ankara reconcile these two clashing identities?
Thank you, Dalia. My work on mediation and the chapter that I wrote for the book that you are one of the editors is not specifically on Africa. Actually, I didn't. I didn't touch on Africa, Turkey's involvement in Africa as a case study, but in the initial draft, I remember using Africa as a test case study. And as for your question, I think from Ankara's perspective, the answer is very straightforward. I mean, Turkish officials would probably ask, where is the contradiction? Especially in today's world, and given how other great powers and middle powers engage with Africa. In fact, if you ask this question to the officials in Ankara, they would likely reverse the question and they would ask, how can you mediate in today's conflicts if you have no leverage, no access, no assets, no ability to affect the facts on the ground? So I would not describe this simply as a contradiction, but maybe we can better understand Turkey's mode of engagement as the operating logic of Turkey's current foreign policy. Ankara does not see diplomacy and hard power as separate tracks necessarily, and increasingly treats different instruments, including drones, as mutually reinforcing instruments of diplomacy. So this, I mean, we see a shift. Obviously, in today's Turkey, we see a shift from the earlier AK Party government's foreign policy visions of zero problems with the neighbors. At that time, Turkey's regional role was framed more through soft power, trade, humanitarian diplomacy, cultural affinity, and dialogue, as it also started in Somalia. So those tools are still part of Turkish foreign policy, but since the late 2010s, Turkish foreign policy has become more centralized, more operational, and more transactional. And mediation is still part of that repertoire, but it's not only about offering dialogue or neutral facilitation, but it's also about creating leverage, sustaining access, and producing outcomes, but not comprehensive outcomes, really. Like even limited outcomes are the major, motivation for Ankara's diplomacy. So in my work on Turkey's mediation as a middle power, I call this instrumented indispensability, as you know. And by this I mean that Turkey tries to make itself useful in a crisis by combining diplomacy with tangible instruments, like with its intelligence channels, with logistical routes, with legal gateways and geopolitical positioning, geographic positioning even, humanitarian access, development tools, military training, defense exports, and in some theaters, calibrated coercive pressure as well. So all of these tools are obviously used in the Africa context as well. So for Ankara, the objective, as I said, is not to solve the conflict comprehensively, but often Turkey finds a role for itself which is more limited. Like it's not Turkey's mediation is not measured only by final peace agreements, but more by its crisis management outputs, like creating corridors, creating prisoner swaps in Russia-Ukraine case, like or deconfliction channels. For instance, in Syria, pre-transition, during the war, Astana is a deconfliction channel, for instance, and manage the crisis through humanitarian access, like in Gaza and Sudan, and other technical arrangements. And for instance, in Russia and Ukraine, Turkey was not neutral in the abstract sense. It sold drones to Ukraine, maintained channels with Moscow, applied the Montreux Convention to warship passage, hosted talks between Russia and Ukraine, and also more importantly helped enable the Black Sea grain corridor. So it made itself and its assets useful for a conflict. So this helps understand Turkey's mediation and this contradiction that you mentioned in its Africa policy as well. It's not only a story of Turkey's Africa policy is definitely not a story of drones. Our speakers have given the context very well. It's actually a story of how Ankara builds presence and in some cases converts that presence into some sort of diplomatic leverage. And it's so Ankara is different. I was actually listening to a very recent podcast by Nebahat Tanrıverdi Yaşar, who is also among the participants now. I can see her. So she's saying that, you know, Turkey has a very important comparative point. It's not China. It doesn't have China's financial scale. It's not EU, Europe. It does not operate with the same institutional weight, procedures, and conditionality. And it's not the Gulf that brings some level of capital. But Turkey's advantage is more like speed, flexibility, bilateral access, engagement with medium-sized companies, construction capacity, and now more and more combat-tested defense products, and more importantly, the willingness to move quickly. So this is why Turkey is attractive to many countries in Africa as well, because it's pragmatic, it's flexible, and it's useful. So this is actually what happened in Somalia. I mean, the Turkish model in Somalia is referred a lot as a model engagement, but also criticized a lot for the reasons that were discussed here today. But when we know that when Ethiopia-Somalia crisis emerged, Turkey was not entering from nowhere. It had already accumulated presence in Somalia. It had a security role. It had a development footprint and political access in Mogadishu. But it also had high level like diplomatic and economic relations channels with Ethiopia. And then this is why Ankara was able to host the talks and help produce Ankara Declaration. So I think this for me is one of the clearest African examples of instrumented indispensability that Turkey utilizes in its more and more in its diplomacy. But I think this point needs an important qualification. Turkey does not always convert influence into mediation, or influence does not automatically become a mediation power. So Ankara is more likely to mediate when several conditions come together. It obviously needs access to more than one side. It needs at least enough credibility with the sides to be useful, and Turkey also needs a concrete instrument that other actors may not easily provide, like a venue, a kind of humanitarian channel, or some intelligence relationship, or a defense partnership. So it uses a kind of leverage. And finally, there has to be a political opening, and sometimes Turkey is invited to mediate, sometimes Turkey fills a gap left by others, sometimes it acts as a complementary actor rather than the lead actor. And Somalia-Ethiopia case worked because several of these conditions were present, and Ankara was able to claim relevance. Maybe the contradiction Sahel shows a more difficult picture, because Turkish drones and defense technologies have become attractive to the governments of Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And these governments, because these governments want very fast, affordable, and less conditional security tools, and to diversify their defense partners. It does not make Turkey a relevant or a credible mediator in the Sahel, because defense cooperation may create access to the governments, but it does not automatically create access to insurgent groups, opposition actors, or other social actors. So this is, I think, this is where the controversy enters, and drones can help governments monitor a territory and respond to armed groups, but they can also intensify conflicts and strengthen coercive state practices and create civilian protection concerns. So and this becomes a serious reputational risk for Turkey if there is no conditionality, and if the institutions are weak and oversight is limited in the countries that Turkey sells drones. And then when you look at Libya, it's also different. Turkey entered Libya much more visibly through hard power. In 2019, the security and maritime agreements with the Tripoli-based government helped change the military balance and prevented the collapse of one side of the conflict. So Turkey was not a neutral mediator, but it was a stakeholder. But over time, Turkey tried to convert that hard power role into a kind of conflict management role. It maintained ties with the Tripoli government, but also gradually opened channels with Eastern Libyan actors. And as of now, Ankara is not only engaging with Western Libya, but also with actors linked to Eastern Libya as well. So again, here we see that Ankara is trying to use its defense relationship and military power to create channels across Libya's fragmented security landscape. But one also has to look at not only Turkey's, when it comes to drones and mediation, the contradiction, it's not only about Turkey's external influence, really. There is a domestic political economy behind the defense industry as well. It's not only the defense industry is obviously not only a foreign policy tool. It produces contracts, networks, prestige, and a very successful narrative inside Turkey. So the Turkish companies benefit from it. the ruling elite, the ruling government benefits from it, like as the drone manufacturers are from our president's family. Actually, I mean, this is something that I would contribute in the discussion as well, because for Turkey, it's really not about selling drones to Africa, but the drone industry is important for Turkey, and also it is a very successful, very important electoral narrative as well. And also, at the same time, I think we cannot, I would be very careful not to isolate Turkey as the only disruptive actor, if it is. These theaters, the Horn of Africa, Sahel, are already very crowded theaters, and there are many middle powers, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel now, Iran, Russia, China, great powers as well, France, United States. So they all come with different in different ways. And we have to consider Turkey as part of this wider multipolar security marketplace. And its role has been distinctive because it is a very flexible and fast. It can combine speed and flexibility, let's say. Thanks to its centralized system and its fast decision making processes.
Özge, I'll follow up on one question, and which is from all of you also. So don't hesitate to jump in. Specifically, Khan maybe on this. But what if it's a what if, right? What if Turkey leans too heavily into the hard security agreements? Don't you think that this will risk destroying the reputation, the diplomatic mediation capital it has built all over the last decade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a risk, and that is already, I mean, debated in Turkey's Africa policy. So yes, I mean it can create serious reputational risks, and so Turkey is very much Turkey, and the official rhetoric is very much concentrated on capability provision, but then norm shaping is not that much discussed. Or we can discuss. We can also what is also at risk is the conflict sensitive diplomacy. Like, can it pair this defense cooperation with conflict sensitive diplomacy? And can it develop clearer civilian protection standards? So these are all absent from the discussions. And yes, and the answer to your question is yes. Yeah.
Before going to Khan and have his take on this, there was a very good piece on The Economist recently called something along Meet the New Mediators, in which they talk about Turkey, and they talk about Turkey, KSA, Qatar, and even China, and they show how their mediation capabilities were pretty heavy and good. They don't have the same principled approach to mediation. But despite that, studies showed that even mediation done by autocratic regimes yield pretty good results because they have stakes in the conflict. And so it's a very good piece to read. Khan, do you want to jump in that? Also, I remind the audience that you are free to ask question in the chat box, please. So we can, whatever question you have, we are happy to try to make our panelists answer it. Khan, the floor is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, in bilateral relations, diplomacy, economic security, and socio-cultural relations each constitutes a framework. Deepening relations between the two countries depends on the development of subcategories within each of these frameworks. In this sense, Turkey-Somalia relations are flagship in Turkey's Africa policy. But as Ali or Jauhari emphasized regarding Sudan, there is also a developing process with other African countries. However, each country has different dynamics and the forms of relations vary accordingly. For example, relations between Turkey and Ethiopia are deepening in the economic field. In recent years, they have also deepened in the security field. To put it more accurately, Turkey stands out in terms of cost effectiveness in security equipment, and Ethiopia also has a demand for it. And also, I think Özge is absolutely right to describe the Ankara process as a form of crisis management. But I will add one important point. Turkey has constantly supported the idea of African solutions to African problems. So the goal was never to solve the crisis on behalf of Somalia and Ethiopia. The goal was to create political space for dialogue, reduce tensions, and make it easier for the parties themselves to find a mutually acceptable solution. I think that's a very important distinction because it tells us something about how Ankara understands mediation, not as imposing outcomes, but as facilitating them. I think Turkey sees mediation not as imposing outcomes, but as facilitating them, as I say. And also, Turkey is exporting drones everywhere. How can you still call it a mediator? Maybe you can question it. I think military exports do not automatically prevent mediation. The important issue is whether military partnership become exclusive alliances. Turkey has so far maintained a dialogue with actors that often stand on opposite sides of regional rivalries. That diplomatic flexibility is precisely what enables mediation.
Abdullahi and Jawhara, do you want to jump in? Or should I move to my next question and then open the floor? Okay, so go ahead, please, Jawhara.
No, the points I wanted to bring forward are just comments on the points on Turkey's role in mediation and also the military side. Since I focus mainly on the economic side of things, I think the way I look at it again, there was a mention of Turkey's attempts to re-engage with Eastern Libya, and this for me, and again another point about diplomatic flexibility, which is something I appreciate when we talk about mediation and so on. But where does diplomatic flexibility end then, and contradictions start? Because at the end of the day, any reignition of relations with Eastern Libya puts you in contradiction with your allies in Sudan. So how are decisions going to be made in this case? And I think this goes back to another concept or idea that I think many of us have in the back of their heads, is that for dealing with issues in the Horn of Africa, it's not dealing bilaterally, it's rather a jigsaw puzzle, if I may say. You have to weigh your allies in different parts and then see which ones you want to engage with and when, rather than looking at it in silos. Another point when it comes to this mediation ability of Turkey, I think it would put it, of course, Turkey's involvement in Sudan, I wouldn't rank it as I wouldn't rank it as the first two sponsors, namely like I would say UAE or Egypt and so on. But it would also find itself at a contradiction And it would also find itself at a contradiction when it comes to forcing powers to move things or the political needed. If Turkey wants to be involved around the UAE, there is the NATO dynamics, there is the Middle East dynamics, there are other dynamics in the whole. So how is it going to weigh all these options to play an active role in Sudan, and which we've been seeing some more closer engagement on, at least on the political side. So at the end of the day, I think it would mean that decisions have to be made and sides have to be taken beyond diplomatic flexibility, as mentioned. And lastly, my personal view, of course, the Turkish drones are impressive. This technology is I think gamers dream when it comes to, like, those who like video games and so on. But in reality, it's devastating. Like, for example, in Sudan, since the beginning of this year alone, 80% of civilian casualties are caused by drones. It's not just the Turkish drones, it's RSF drones as well. But I think in the grand scheme of things, beyond national pride and how it's placed nationally, I think people need to look at the long-term effects. And I think this is the reason why armed control deals are brought into place in the first place, to go beyond these national dynamics and so on.
Excellent, Jawhara. This leads me to the yes, Abdullahi. You want to jump in?
Quickly, I just want to give you an example of the current dialogue between the Somali federal government and the opposition groups, where the issue of Turkish government's mediation role has been on the spotlight. And in this case, for example, Turkey is not necessarily seen as a neutral mediator, but by the opposition. But there's that question of how much leverage does the Turkish government has on the Somali federal government. So in that case, for example, the Turkish government might play a role, not necessarily because they are neutral. They're seen neutral by both sides, but because they have a leverage on one side and can bring that side to the table. That might not be the case for example, in the Ethiopia, Tigray versus the federal government of Ethiopia, where the Tigray, regional government might have more hostilities towards for example, the Turkish government, more than the opposition groups in Somalia have towards the Turkish government. Just wanted to share that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullahi. I mean, if I don't see any question in the chat box, so participant, if you have no question, I'll move on with mine, but do not hesitate again. But I have one question for all of you, and we've been talking about it prior to this meeting in the preparatory meeting, and we'll start, I guess, with Ozge, but it's the same question to everyone. It's a long-term question, yes, for the long term. So if there is one major vulnerability that could derail Turkey's Red Sea strategy in the next 12 months, what is it? Please go ahead, Ozge, and then I'll give the floor to Abdullahi, Jawhara, and Khan.
Well, Dalia, I think I'm gonna quote Khan and say that the major challenge is political trust, and precisely for the reasons that Jawhara and Abdullahi mentioned. The real question for Turkey and Turkish foreign policy makers is whether they can turn their relevance, operational, historical, military relevance into political trust. I think that is where the future of Turkish model will be tested.
I'm gonna follow up with one question. Do you think that the disappearance, be it biological or just political, like if he's not voted again, of Erdogan would make a difference in the foreign policy of the country?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay, so well, the change of government is not on the horizon for now, but I think it won't really change it immediately, because the other political actors, like the opposition political actors in Turkey, Africa is really not in their political agenda. I mean, I never hear any criticism about government's foreign policy in Africa from major opposition figures in Turkey. That might mean they lack any vision, or maybe it's not their priority because there are many other domestic priorities to complain about and to criticize about. But I think if there is a change in government, depending on what kind of political actor will take up the role after 23, I mean, after more than 20 years of AK Party governance, who built those relations with Africa beyond foreign policy in many different sectors. I think it will take time for any emerging leader and its team of policymakers to build these relations, to understand those relations first, and then to rebuild them. And one can only expect more better relations and better not expect but hope for better relations based on political trust, I guess, but by keeping the positive relations, the positive exchanges between the African states and Turkey that has been built over the time
with
with
the
the
decades, yeah.
current government.
Jawhara, what's your take on my question? Do you want me to repeat it, or you're good? But what do you think that the one thing that could derail Turkish foreign policy in, for instance, the Horn, but in this case in Sudan? Also, Mehari asked a very good question, because you, Jawhara, you talked about 80% of the casualties being casualties of drones, but you insisted in making a nuance. These are not only, of course, Turkish drones, but yet Mehari is asking, is Turkey exercising military power without accountability, for example, regarding the civilian casualties resulting from drones and drone diplomacy? Jawhara, the floor is.
Yeah, thank you. I'll first answer your question and then I'll delve into Mihari's question. So whether there is something that could derail Turkey's role or maritime plans in the region for the next period, I would say, or re-emphasize the point that I mentioned earlier, is the ability to balance all the fronts, the relationships with all the countries, and how it balances in general. Their policy in Libya, how it marries with the policy in Sudan, the policy in Sudan, how it marries with the policy in Ethiopia, and as if everyone knows, these countries within or amongst themselves, it's a very complicated relationship dynamic. With regards to Mihai's question, indeed, I think it is power without accountability for two reasons. In the case of Sudan, these deals are being created in a war situation where there is no citizen overview of these deals. There is no legislative power, and there is no access even to the nature of the contracts being signed. And of course, the situation of war, people call it an emergency situation, so this is justified with the emergency rule that is happening. This is in general. Specifically to the case of Sudan, the current government, the Sudanese government, for many people, is not internationally recognized. So many people since the coup in 2021 have not gone back to normalizing ties with the government. So it also gives the door to questioning whether the government in the first place is in a place to sign these deals. The second point regarding this is the situation of the trade embargo in the country. For many years, we had a trade embargo on Darfur. It doesn't extend to the rest of the country, so mainly in Darfur. And again, the logic behind these treaties is to stop stop getting weapons into areas where there is possibility of war crimes. But in the case of Sudan, to avoid this, we've been seeing some reports about Turkish weapons and equipments being transported through Mali, for example. Some equipments being transported through Ethiopia. And more recently, flights directly from Turkey to Port Sudan. So this also raises the question of to what extent is Turkey in the gray zone of the international treaties that are governing the current war dynamics in Sudan, or is it straight up violating the existing frameworks? So yes, indeed, it's a military power without accountability, I would say, because the situation is just right for this.
Thank you, Jawhara. Abdullahi?
Well, I will argue if in the Somali context, for example, one thing that will derail the Turkish government's the Turkish relationship with the Somalia, for example, it's how much does the Turkish government maintain neutrality in Somalia, while, as I mentioned earlier, the Turkish have maintained that strong relationship with any government that comes to power, focusing on institutional building. And that is how the Turkish portrayed themselves so far. There is the question of the internal politics, where the current president, for example, is trying to consolidate power. The rivalry between the center and the periphery, where the federal member state feel more empowered. The federal system will take away the federal constitutional powers, and where the current president and his political party are modeling themselves after the AK party of Erdogan in Turkish, where critics say the current president wants to remain in power for the next 20 years or so. So what will that mean for the opposition? And will that push them towards more Turkish, hostile competitors? For example, in the case of the UAE-Israeli axis, for example, or to others that might emerge. So if another political leader comes to power that is have grown hostile to the Turkish, will that change the dynamic? So that is one I would say, and how the Turkish handles that complex internal political dynamics in Somalia.
Thank you, Abdullahi Khan. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I have 3 questions. Is it true?
Go ahead.
First question, can I read this question? There are critical views on Turkey's export of... Okay. I think we should be
You
careful.
have answered the second one.
It's the first question.
You have the first question, and you have also my question about what will be the element that you think would derail
Yes.
Turkey's path into the Red Sea. Please go ahead.
Okay. First question is, I think we should be careful not to overstate Turkey's influence over domestic political dynamics. The constitutional debates in Somalia or federal tensions in Ethiopia are deeply rooted in each country's own political history. Turkey's primary objective has been to strengthen state institutions rather than promote a specific political model. Of course, every external partner brings its own experiences, but ultimately this political arrangement must be decided by the countries themselves. So Turkey supports institutions, not a particle constitutional model. And second question is, Turkey is exercising military power without accountability, drone diplomacy, etc. I think accountability is an important question for every country that exports defense equipment, not only Turkey. From Ankara's perspective, drones are part of broader security cooperation requested by sovereign governments facing serious security threats such as terrorism. Their use remains the responsibility of recipient state and must comply with international humanitarian law. At the same time, I think it would be misleading to reduce Turkey's engagement in Africa to drone exports alone. Security cooperation is only one pillar of a much broader partnership that also includes diplomacy, development, humanitarian assistance, and institutional building. For your question, actually, I can say that I'm on the same page as Özge. If I had to identify one major vulnerability, I would say the growing imbalance between security engagement and diplomatic engagement. Turkey has built considerable trust across the Red Sea through humanitarian assistance, development, cooperation, and mediation. If that identity becomes overshadowed by defense export or military agreements alone, Ankara could gradually lose the very comparative advantage that distinguishes it from other external actors. In my view, Turkey's greatest strategic assets is not its military footprint, it's a diplomatic credibility. Protecting the credibility should remain Ankara's top priority, in my opinion.
Well, Özge, yes,
Yeah.
I was going to come back to you.
Sorry. So as for Mehari's question, the second question, I'm gonna answer purely from the security defense segment, basically. Of course, there are, Turkey's humanitarian development policies in Africa are hugely accountable, and they are promoted by the government. And I think everyone would remember Somalia. Might remember, like, our president and his wife going to Somalia to initiate this huge international mobilization. So these are all accountable, and that they become part of the public debate, obviously. But I have to say that there is Turkey exercising military power. Turkey exercised military power without much accountability, and there are, I think, I don't know, Kaan, you can disagree or maybe add more. I think the reason behind that is because most of these relations are run by intelligence, and in the whole world, like the intelligence plays a huge part in Turkish intelligence actors play huge part in managing these relations. So in everywhere in the world, intelligence is not that accountable. Like the policies are not always accountable and out in the public. And the second, as I mentioned, there is no public discussion. The alternative political actors in Turkey, they don't really, it's not on their agenda. They don't make it as an agenda, although it's a very valid, it could have been a valid criticism of government's foreign policy. They don't care. They don't seem to have any vision, any alternative vision than what Turkey is currently doing. One has to check the parliamentary proceedings. Obviously, maybe Nebahat and some other people have done that. Like maybe in the parliament, there might be those discussions. I'm not aware, especially when sending troops to Libya. Probably, some opposition could have been voiced. And also the third reason for non-accountability is Turkish government is reaping the benefits of this very extremely centralized system and centralized decision making, where the foreign policy is also part of that centralized decision making.
Thank you, Ozge, for this. So we have 5 minutes left, and I will give the floor to each of you for 30 seconds, 1 minute maximum. If you had one grab and go idea that you want the audience to live with today about Turkey's footprint in the Red Sea, what would that be? Can very quickly, and then we move. Can Jawhara, Ozge, Abdullahi. Please go ahead.
Okay. One sentence. I think Turkey does not define its Africa policy through drones. It defines it through partnerships. Thank you.
Jawhara.
I would say Turkey has a good potential of being a credible partner in the Horn if it manages its contradictions correctly.
Excellent. Ozge.
I think we need more discussions between Turks and Somalians, Sudanese, Africans to impact the government's policies and to balance every contradiction that we have discussed in this webinar.
I love this idea. It's a good policy advice to Turkey policy makers. I agree. I think we need more, and this is why we did also the book, and we came up with the idea because there was talk in the GCC and the MENA about the Red Sea and talks about the Red Sea, in Africa, but the two actors did not really succeed in talking, and we hope that our book will help you bridge the gap. Do not hesitate to download it, and please, Abdullahi, the last word is yours.
Thank you. I want to make 2 points. Turkey is becoming, is a strategic security and political partner in Somalia and the wider Horn of Africa. But I also want to add that the states in the Horn of Africa are not looking to become doing strategic hedging by engaging multiple external partners to maximize national security interest while also minimizing dependence. And there are other players in the field.
Well, Abdullahi, Khan, Ozge, Jawhara, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, participants, for staying until the last minute. Again, do not hesitate to download the book. And I wish you all a great weekend and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.